I'm Jim.
And I'm Kate, and welcome to episode 7 of the Creative Content Studio podcast.
What are we talking about today, Catherine?
Today, using the full name, today we're talking about recording 101 from script to session. So diving on in, I think I say that most episodes now. But
yeah, where are we diving?
We're diving into the pool of ideas.
Podcasts.
And the pool of podcasts, the podcast pool.
Wonderful. Right.
So, first question around that. So it would be, do you need a script? Do you need to write a script for plan out for every minute, second of your podcast session before you start recording? Or can you just wing it?
No and yes.
Right. Explain. Elaborate, if you would.
I thought you were going to go into Vanilla Ice then for a minute.
What?
That's stop, collaborate and listen. We are. Sorry, producer. There's an example of the producer not being happy with our execution of the script. Yeah. So it depends on your content. I feel like that's my answer to every week, which is why I say no and yes. So no, you don't, particularly depending on what sort of style of show you've got, what your format is, etc. So if your show is supposed to be quite organic, quite freewheeling, then no, you don't. The yes element is, I think, even if it's not really well scripted show, there needs to be some milestones, and that's just to avoid you slipping into a trap of it being completely rudderless. You don't want to be. I don't think, unless you're an incredibly skilled informer or entertainer or whatever it is that you are, I think it's very difficult to just completely ad-lib off the cuff on a given subject and it be good. So have some milestones at the very least. I'll say as well, when it comes to interview shows and scripting, this is one area where I think, as you become more comfortable with the concept of interviewing people, or you may already be comfortable before you get into the idea of a podcast, then you might be quite comfortable asking interesting questions off the back of what somebody's just said and that sort of stuff. And what I sometimes find is shows that are too scripted, that are interview shows, where the host has a very clear set of questions that they want to ask. Sometimes the host can miss the opportunity to ask the question that is on the lips of the audience because they're too concerned with getting to their next question. So this is where I say, allow yourself some wriggle room. This is why it's no and yes. Okay.
And it's I think you said before, it's not always the written down question. The gold is in the follow-up question. So necessarily what you have written down, but like you said, sort of playing off some information or a nugget that the guest might have given you and trying to go off script a little bit, which I suppose takes a bit of skill and a bit of practice, right? But like you say, it depends how confident you are in the first place.
Yeah, if you take, for example, a show that's about talking to founders of businesses as an example, the question that everybody wants to ask usually when they start this is, how did you get started in X business? And that's interesting. The answer to that is interesting, but it's usually the follow-up question where you ask, well, why did you get into that? Or what led you to that particularly? Or tell me more about that. You mentioned that there was a falling out with a co-founder. Tell me more about that. It's that stuff that's probably going to get you the kind of the real gold in terms of engagement and in terms of creating an informative and entertaining podcast. That first question, if you imagine you've got you had a really clear chronology in your questions that was I'm going to ask them how they got started, and then I'm going to ask them about the new product they've launched. And if you're too set on that, you can sometimes miss those follow-ups. So have the milestones, have the places that you want to stop off on your kind of journey in the episode, but be flexible enough that you could just ask a question because something's interested you. And the other aspect of that is you don't want to let your scripting, your questioning stop you from listening. And I've seen this lots as with interviewers. And in fact, I had if I go back, give you a really specific example, I had a podcast interviewee who was fairly high profile in the particular world that I was in, and their PR people had asked me to give them very specific questions and were quite strict about, this person only wants to be asked these questions that we've agreed with you. And as a result, it put me in such a kind of quandary, because that wasn't my normal style, that it wasn't a very good interview, and I couldn't focus properly on the answers I was being given because I was too worried about getting to the next question and how I was going to frame it and that sort of thing. So no, but yes.
You kind of want, especially with interview shows, to be quite conversational, and that makes them more relatable. And obviously, as well as finding the gold from the guests, which makes them kind of more human and puts the human behind the business, like your example of the co-founders of a company, you also kind of, it all adds to that, doesn't it? It's just like humanising the subject a little bit more.
Absolutely. The kind of the what and the how are only ever so interesting with anybody's story. It's always the why that's the bit that gets you beyond that.
The why is the clincher. And so kind of leading on from that, what would you say is like the number one sort of mistake people potentially would make with like their first or few recording sessions? Anything, obviously we've kind of talked about the yes and the no of the previous question, but anything else that you think has stood out?
I think the most common mistake, and this is, I'm trying to be really broad here and across formats, but I think the most common mistake that I see with podcasts is not having any format or any script at all. They haven't got the milestones in place per se of what we're going to talk about. They're just almost, there's a tendency, particularly when you have co-hosted shows, particularly, we talked about this a few times, but when we've got that kind of group dynamic of, well, we're really interesting when we're together, or, my friend and I, we have such great banter when we're in the pub that it'll be amazing if we put a couple of mics in front of us. That kind of thing with no milestones is really commonplace. People doing that sort of thing, or thinking, I'll just do an interview show and the guest's going to give me all of the content. I just need to sit there and sort of say, so tell me how your business got started. And yeah, that will get you so far. But I think those are the mistakes that I see, is not having enough structure. As well, I mean, I suppose on the other side of the spectrum, you can be over structured, but we talked about that really, particularly the interview show falls foul of that. Obviously, if it's the more sort of documentary style, that kind of thing, then the more scripting probably the better. So yeah, it depends on your format. But that biggest mistake is, I think, having nothing planned outside of nothing
prepared. But I suppose as well, it might depend on your guest a little bit, because you mentioned having not a tricky guest, but like a guest that made your natural style a little bit more difficult to continue. But like if the guest is particularly nervous, maybe, then it might be also good to have something prepared if you need to do maybe a bit more of the talking than you normally would in that sort of situation. So you can kind of guide them back on track if they're not giving you all of it like you kind of were hoping they would, type thing. I'm not blaming guests. I'm trying to make anyone who's going to guest on the podcast any more nervous. But I think as the host or co-host, you have some sort of responsibility to have a basic plan for your episodes.
As the host, yeah, it's your responsibility to put the guest at ease.
Exactly.
And I think the biggest error, or I've just said the biggest error was not having any milestones, but another particular pitfall I think that new interviewers in podcast settings can fall foul of is they think too much about it being a conversation. Now, that sounds a bit strange.
Contradictory to what I just said before, but then...
But there's a point to it. There's a point to it, because I'm not saying you're actually very right. You want it to be conversational, but you want it to come across conversational in the final piece, in the edit.
Yeah.
So what do I mean by that? So I think if somebody is sort of, particularly sometimes you get a guest who's perhaps a bit nervous and they're kind of talking their way into being comfortable, let them go. Let them have the floor. Let them say everything that they need to say. Don't feel the need to interrupt. Don't feel the need to affirm all the time vocally. So the normal rules of conversation kind of, they do and they don't apply. They They do once you get to the listener. The listener needs to feel like it was natural and it was a conversation and it wasn't stilted. In the on the recording session, it doesn't necessarily need to be that way. And a few things of particular note on that regard. One is you don't need to affirm everything that the person says. It can be really tempting to, because that's what nice people do when they're trying to encourage somebody else to talk, is they say mm-hmm and yeah, and they do all that kind of stuff. Try and practice doing that non-verbally. So nods are great, and and for those listening, Kate is doing that now. You can give visual cues of engagement. You can appear engaged with your eye contact, with your body language, those kind of things. Do all the smiling, all those kind of things. You can do all of that stuff. But if you're constantly saying uh-huh and yeah, then your editor's going to have to take those out, or depending on your recording setup, it might be difficult to remove them completely. Hopefully it's not, because you're recording separately, but that's for another episode. But listeners don't want to hear them. Ultimately, they don't want to hear those all the time. They're actually quite distracting and quite annoying. They just want to hear the guest. And similarly, try and resist the urge to, and I know again this is normal conversation, but try and resist the urge, unless your format really does allow, whatever format would allow this, but I don't know, but resist the urge to talk over them, let them talk themselves out, and then once you see the cues that they're finishing up, that's the time to jump in with your next question, for the reason that your editor, or you if you're the editor, is going to have a much easier time than making that a natural conversation than if you jumped in with, oh, that reminds me of the time my Auntie Sue did that. Does that need to happen? Did you absolutely have to say that at that very given moment? Also, you might be missing an opportunity, because sometimes people meander to something else really interesting. So let them go, see what comes of it, and then ask a follow-up question afterwards. Also, in my experience, that makes people feel a lot more comfortable as well. So if we're talking about nervous guests and things like that, if they know that they've got the floor and they know that you're not trying to make the show about yourself, they tend to open up a bit more.
Okay. You mentioned editing there, and we do cover that in our next episode. In episode 8 is what happens in the edit. So we'll cover more about that. But
good use of structure there, and keeping to the milestones.
There you go. I'm trying.
So you're keeping me on track. That's good.
But also, this is a bit of not a tricky question, but like a question with multiple answers, because what would a typical recording session look like? But again, that depends on a number of factors, like where you're recording. Are you remotely recording? Are you recording in a studio with someone there, an engineer there to help? Is it audio only? Is it video as well? But, what does it typically look like and involve, I guess? I know we've covered gear that people would have previously on other episodes, and, how to plan. But when you're actually sitting down to record, what does that tend to look like? Yeah,
I think, as you've kind of alluded to, it depends upon the setup that you've got going on. But there are some tips I'd give for different setups, particularly. So if it's online, if it's virtual, so you're using Riverside, using Squadcast, you might be using Zoom, that sort of thing. And just a technical point, if you are using Zoom, because I just was discussing this with a client recently, who's recorded an awful lot of episodes before coming to work with us, is go into settings, find the recording section, and make sure you've clicked separate audio files for each participant. Just a little Zoom top
Zoom
tip.
users tip. Thank you.
Make sure you do that, and whatever platform you're using, you want separate audio files. The reason you want that is because sometimes, particularly with remote guests, there's somebody knocking on their front door, there's a dog running around, there might be a dog in your setting running around, or a little one, or something's going on that's distracting. If the guest is talking at that particular time and they're not distracted by it, they carry on, or the host is, you can take that out in post with the edit. So just a top tip on Zoom, just make sure you've got that clicked. But if you're doing something remote, obviously you want to make sure as much has been given to the guest in advance as possible in terms of tech, so that they're comfortable. Our aim here is we want to make the guest, in whichever setting we're in, comfortable. So the advice is slightly different in different places. So if it's remote, I would say then 100%. Make sure you've given them as much advice as possible in terms of, should they be wearing headphones? Have they got a mic? If they haven't, what they can use instead, that kind of stuff. Get them to not use Bluetooth, all the kind of the technical stuff that we might talk about in more depth on another episode. But that wants to be out the way. You don't want to be, you talk about making people uncomfortable. When people are remote and they can't make things work, and we've probably all been on meetings with work and stuff, remote meetings, and so you've got a big presentation maybe to do online, it's virtual, and there's people going, oh, can you hear me? Can you see me? All my slides don't work, all that kind of stuff, and it makes people anxious. So try and get that out of the way as much as possible. Familiarise yourself with the platform, because you might, if you're running the podcast yourself, you're going to have to be tech troubleshooting for that person, make them feel at ease with all of that, and then get to recording as quickly as possible once you've got through that. If you're recording in person with somebody and you've got, and it's not a studio setting, so you're doing it in person, but you're setting up the gear, what I find, if time allows, of course, somebody might be super busy, but is to leave, even if they are super busy, leave something that you can set up whilst they're there with you. So kind of the opposite in a way, because you setting up and them almost helping you is a great time to build a little bit of rapport and make them comfortable. So it might just be as simple as, if you know that the guest is busy and they haven't got time for all of that, then it might be as simple as just, oh, can I get you to do a couple of mic checks for me? How does that lighting look on this camera? Can you just have a look at this screen for me? That sort of thing. All of that kind of thing just helps relax people and make them feel like they're part of your process. So it takes away some of that formal. If you imagine like coming to a studio and you've never been to a podcast studio before, and there's lights and there's cameras and there's a camera switcher and there's somebody with a clapperboard and there's stuff, going on, that can be quite intimidating. So being a little bit set at ease with your host can help, and one way to do that is to do the setup. Obviously, if you're in a studio space, your studio will hopefully make you feel at ease, and that's kind of part of their job, really, is to make you feel comfortable alongside the host. So it's a bit of a tag team then between the host and the studio to make your guests feel at ease. But I would say from your number one point of call, outside of make sure you understand the tech and you're really comfortable with it, is to make your guests at ease, and there's different ways to do that depending on the setting. Okay.
And that makes a bit of a nice segue into kind of another question about the value of recording in like a studio of sorts compared to doing it yourself. So obviously there's a lot of factors that would contribute to whether you choose to do that or not. But if you do decide to kind of invest that time and stuff and money, because it does cost money, in using a professional space, what's the additional value you can get from that compared to doing it on your own?
Yeah, well, I mean, as you'd expect, really, you're just going to have it all taken out of your hands, all of the stuff that might be a little bit tricky to navigate, the tech, the lights, in this particular case, have we got enough hard drive space and all that kind of stuff? Is the angle right for me? What does the lighting look like? Is my mic at the right level? Is my mic positioned correctly? All of that kind of stuff is going to be taken out of your hands. And you should be at ease to create the content. That in our space, that's what our ultimate goal is, to get people to be thinking about their own content, not thinking about how does it look, how is it framed, was the lighting correct, all that kind of stuff. So that's, I think, the major advantage. And as a host, so if you're hosting other people and you're renting out the space and then you're bringing the guests to come with you, you've got a team. Then instantly you've gone from a solo podcaster who has to do it all to, I can just think about my questions. I can just think about putting my guest at ease. That's worth its weight, really. Like for a podcaster who's trying to produce something really high quality, and doing it alone without a team, you're hiring a team for that period of time.
Yeah, that support. I think actually we probably might have to do some additional episodes. You kind of touched upon it, maybe about what a typical recording session would look like, or tips and tricks for depending on your format. So maybe we do like, what would be really helpful for an interview format to know, what would be really helpful for, maybe a bit more specific, just an idea. Maybe it's something we can track back to. I
think that is a good idea, yeah.
Because there's lots of different formats out there and lots of different content creators out there. Something else maybe I just thought of, you talk about sort of scripting or like milestones. When you're kind of talking or interviewing somebody or even like doing a solo show, is it worth thinking about topics to raise or questions to ask that then might end up giving you something clippable? That then, because obviously we've talked about in some of our other posts, 5 ways that you can use a podcast, transcribing it for a blog, and using it for like a full-on recording for YouTube, but also social clips. And you can chop up a podcast and use it for multiple social clips. So is it worth trying to think of something, not obviously putting that pressure on your guest by say something that's really good that I can clip up and make as a good post for my socials, but is it something that you can maybe try and work into your planning?
100%. Yeah, think about, you should be, to a degree, you should be aware of what your guest is going to say, roughly. I mean, obviously, ideally, there's a little bit of surprise in there too, but you have to anticipate the kind of directions that your guest might go in, and the stories that they might have. If they've got any form of profile at all, whether it's, there could be a small business owner, but they've got some online profile, maybe they've been in local news, through to a really big guest who's obviously going to have certain things that they can talk about that are going to be interesting, then yeah, absolutely plan those in. Sometimes, like, depending on the profile of your guest, if it's something particularly controversial, you might just want to talk about it a little bit in advance with them first. And some people want to know topics in advance, and that's fine. Some people want to know specific questions. Again, that's up to you and them to negotiate that as to whether you want to do that as part of your style. I've known podcasters who do interviews who say they won't do that. They'll refuse to give the questions in advance. And I've known others who are quite happy to work alongside. But if your podcast is quite small, and maybe it's like, business owners talking to each other, that kind of thing, and that there's a particularly controversial thing that you could talk about, maybe just have a chat with them in advance if you're comfortable doing so before you sort of spring anything on them. But yeah, think about in advance where the clips might be, and it might not be even a controversial thing. It might just be, I know that this person could give some amazing advice on this topic if I just asked them about it. I've heard them do great social clips about it before, maybe, or I saw them write an amazing blog on this on LinkedIn or something, that if they gave us a little bit of that in a face-to-face, it would be amazing. It would be a great clip. So yeah, think about those kind of things, and it depends a little bit on your relationship with your guest as well. If you know them very, very well, you might have even worked that out a little bit together. You don't want it to be too choreographed, but
yeah, going back to what we've been saying.
But you can do. I've seen people kind of do that before, is tee it up. But also remember, a lot of it's found in the edit. So
well, that's what I was about to say. So kind of a lot of it's found in the edit, and I think you were asked by a client this week, it's like, how do you know what the gold is? Like, how do you know what to edit? And you did, well, it's kind of, there's a feeling to it. There's something that you can imagine as a clip. I mean, you probably best to answer this in your own words, but you were asked that last week by somebody. So it also, if you're not entirely sure, if you think that anything is clippable, you watch it back and go, I don't know what I'd do with that. Then sometimes put some faith in an editor if you have one, or maybe seek out somebody to help with editing. We can help with editing if you need any sort of support in that area. So is that...
Clips is probably another whole... I mean, you could do a whole episode in itself on clips, but I suppose ultimately, like with everything, you start with the end in mind. You start with, what's the goal of the clip? What is it that I'm trying to do? Am I trying to tease somebody to watch this with a hook, with a bit of clickbait? Am I trying to sort of, give them a controversial moment, but not finish the outcome of what the person said in the story? So it's like, oh my word, I better go and listen to that. So you could be trying to do that. You might be just trying to create really informative clips that you can share on social media to help build your profile and your expertise, or the perception of your expertise in a given area. So that might be much more kind of like informative. It might be, you know, here's 3 ways in which you can do. So you still got a hook there, but it's not kind of a, oh my God, what's going to happen? It's not the sort of end of EastEnders. It's like 3 things that you can, where you can do X, and then you proceed to find the 3 things within the episode that you talked about. It could be that. So the style of the clip that you're trying to get to is the key, really, and so you can then sort of reverse engineer that back into the podcast itself, or you can just rely on the edit. There are lots of bits of software now that will help you with this. Descript, Opus Clip are 2 of them. CapCut's built it in as well, where you can put in a full podcast episode and say to it, I want 10 clips and they need to be about 30 seconds long. And it will find 10 clips and it will tell you why it thinks they have the potential to do well on social media. I find it's mixed results. I'm sure, like with all AI stuff, it will get better. I can't bury my head in the sand about that. But they're worth exploring, particularly if your budget doesn't necessarily stretch to editor, and you're on your own. My experience is Descript's probably the better of those 3 that I mentioned in terms of the quality of the output. They've also got things like stock footage that you can put in there. You can use customized fonts for the subtitles, that it'll caption it for you, all that kind of stuff that you see on social media clips. Or you could simply cut it up and then rely on your social media platform like Instagram to caption it for you when you post it. You know, that, I mean, there's lots of different ways, but finding the clip is probably the first thing to do. Yeah.
Cool. Okay, loads of good advice in there.
Mm.
Thank you. Anything else you think we should cover on the topic of recording the actual session itself?
I think we've talked about, tech and making people feel comfortable. I think those are
the most important things.
Those are all of the things. Have a good conversation with your guest in advance if it's an interview. If it's co-hosted, or you kind of know what your aims for the episode are, and you've talked about those and you're clear on those in advance. Recording sessions for things like the documentary styles and stuff like that, and panels and things are slightly different again. And I won't get too much into the weeds of those, but again, you have to prepare differently for the different formats. So like you said earlier, we could go to town on tips for interviews, we could go to town on tips for solo shows, that kind of stuff.
We'll get back to that maybe.
But I think hopefully we've given something for this week that will be of value to people starting out, particularly.
Absolutely. Thank you.
What we'll talk about next week?
The editing process.
Oh yeah, you said earlier.
I did, yeah. We'll be discussing that in a bit more detail and what that looks like. There we go.
Producer's accusing me of not listening.
Yeah, he's vocal today.
Giving feedback in the moment. I like it. Right then. That's
awesome.
that. So see you next time.
Bye.